can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show's support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. Today I'm delighted to be joined by sports psychologist Dr Laura Carey, coming from University of the West of Scotland. Laura, firstly, it's brilliant to have you on the show. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, and thank you very much for the invite. Looking forward to kind of chatting on this podcast, and yeah, good to think about all things golf.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I say this about all my guests, but I do actually really mean it today. I have been really looking forward to this conversation just because we're talking about the sort of neuroscience of performance. And I think for a lot of coaches, there's observable things that we can see, but we lack or quite ignorant towards what's happening inside the athlete's head in this. And I think your research, and we're going to talk today about your latest research, which was sort of looking at golf putting tasks and some of the insight that can give us, not just inside that sport, but also there could be some transferable benefit, you'll tell me. And I think it presents a really cool opportunity for people that are listening, that are coaching, to just get that insight that they've been after. So what we might, before we delve into your article, which was published, if I recall correctly, it was published in the sort of Frontiers in Psychology journal, and it was titled "Commit to Your Putting Stroke: Exploring the Impact of Quiet Eye Duration and Neuroactivity in Golf Putting Performance." Before we get into that, I just would quite like to know just what brought you to this field of study. Why does it have value, and what's its sort of relevance to coaching?
Yeah, thanks. And it's always a good question in terms of what brought me to this, because as I was in a position of where I got asked by my kind of former employees to kind of do a PhD in golf putting performance. And at the time I was a full-time practitioner working as a sport and exercise scientist, and golf was one of those sports that we worked with because it was really good for Scotland. And it was also, in terms of the putting, it was something that was really exciting for us because we would see, and often if you do play golf, maybe you can really able to relate to this, but this idea of sometimes you go, it's amazing, you're playing really well, but maybe a day later or maybe a week later, you somehow feel like you've lost your ability on the putting green and you don't know why you can't put or what's happening. And we wouldn't often see those extremes, those highs and lows so much in the other sports we work with. So that was something that we were really keen to explore of, how do we make people improve their putting performance? Because it is one of the most important parts of the game. Like, I think there was an old phrase that said, put for Joe, drive for show. And although it's probably not quite as much now, there is still the element of putting is the end of the game. And if you can improve your round by one stroke, it is going to make a significant difference to, if you're into it, your earnings, but your performance and whether you make the cut or how well you actually do in that competition. So it has real performance benefits in terms of being able to improve it. So that's kind of the first kind of thing for me, is I was always keen to research something that would have a change to someone's behavior or would help people continue to improve their performance and ultimately achieve their goals. I think the second part of this idea of why is this thing happening? How do we, and then when you watch golfers, sometimes you see them go through exactly the same pre-performance routine. And you think, why is it that they do that behavior and it's exactly the same potentially, but they get a completely different outcome for a different one? And often that was where, in some of kind of my conversations as a psychologist, we'd talk about the pre-performance routine. And being able to use the technology in this space is actually really important for me because it allows you to have a conversation and maybe look at what other factors might be contributing. So obviously golf's quite complex. It could be the weather, there could be a whole host of things that are contributing. But one of the nice things about this, particularly looking at the brain, is it allowed us to have a conversation around when are you on and when are you off. But if
Mm,
you are, like we would see those extremes, but it'd help us to be able to go, well, is there a difference? Is something different going on in your brain? Because you might not feel a difference, you might see a difference in your performance, but let's have a conversation, let's explore that to see what's going on. So I think the technology in this space has really helped us to be able to add to that conversation, gain insights into what's actually happening, and really can improve the coach kind of golfer relationship so that you've got something that you can both kind of work with and work towards.
mm, yeah. I mean, firstly, I mean, I certainly, I've on the golf course, it's not so much success for me. I'm still kind of starting the driving range actually. If I need to get off that and go onto the green, but um, I would like to stick with that just for a little short while. Actually, just the surrounding sort of context of the work because it is quite interesting. Like, because you mentioned around that this seems to be like these pressure moments that come from like dead ball sort of certainly in golf, the putting aspect. These are moments where if anything, you would expect that the environment's quite predictable, maybe in some respect. I don't know, but there's a fits point, and therefore, like there's pre-performance routines, and there seems like there's a lot of controllable like opportunities for the athlete to try and hone in on what they've done time after time. Yet you see still varying results in the performances. Does that kind of speak to the contradiction that why this is worthwhile work because maybe it isn't as predictable as what I'm making out. Is it actually that the performance is very it's dependent on a lot of other factors, and your work, I suppose, and looking at the brain is starting to kind of enlighten what's going on there a little bit more. It's just interesting. I'm thinking
Yeah.
about
And I
it.
think the key, so obviously in the paper that we'll probably get on to discussing, we tried to make much more of a lab environment and much more consistency. We did have
Mm,
some kind of moving around with the puts and tried to add in a little bit of uniqueness, but there was a lot of repetitive puts. But I think what's really important in golf when you're researching it is to capture that representative nature. So to
mm,
create kind of the unique where you only get one go or you have to hole out, and you take into consideration the green speed, the weather. What's really difficult for us in research is, we cannot find £1 million from somewhere unless someone wants to donate me £1 million for research to put it up as a prize. But we're never really going to be able to replicate the financial or the life-changing moments that you might have if you hole a putt.
mm,
So some of those clutch puts are really difficult to replicate in research. So we can replicate some of the challenges from a task perspective, and definitely
mm.
from the interaction with the environment. But from a psychological, social pressure, yes, we can create leaderboards. I think it's really cool if you're doing that within a university team or within an already established team, and you've got people who, even if it is professionals, they do care because it's a bit of banter with their friends
Aye,
as well.
aye.
But we're not going to recreate the pressure of, say, maybe how it feels to hole on the 18th at the Open, or even just talking about the Olympic for the golf as well. So I think we have to acknowledge how far our representative nature in terms of the pressure can go, but in terms of
Mm,
being able to recreate the complexity of some of the perceptual challenges, at least, I think we can definitely recreate that
yeah.
within a research design.
So, I mean, no, and thanks, and it's really interesting straight away that you're giving that insight and how actually experimental research works and the limitations of when you set this up. But what's really interesting is you've described as the actual brain activity in itself is that's really interesting because there's in what you've shown so in this paper is that you've been able to get an insight into that with quite like and quite a lot of reliability, perhaps. Can where do you think is the best place to start then? Because we could work through the work. I think what might be useful, as long as you're okay with it, tell us a little bit about the work that's been done to date on this topic, and maybe if you can introduce us as well to what was some of the sort of key drivers or frameworks that you utilised within your work, and we can kind of pick them apart and kind of speak to some of them if you will. So what was the sort of the mini lit review, if you can sum that up and as credibly as, but that's a bit of a task, but whatever you can do in that respect would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll try my very best. I think what's really interesting with looking at sports EEG research is this notion of the task. Is somebody going to be given a putter, or do they use their own putter that's been professionally fitted? What surface are you going to? Is it going to be the same green speed as what they would use if you are playing competitively? And so there's those kind of choices in terms of the methodology and the design of, do you want to be able to create lots of kind of repetitive puts? And potentially when we're looking at it in terms of from a really theoretical point of view, that's really useful. But if you're then going to go really down into this is for practitioners, this is to do recommendations for the applied world, then I think we need to really shift towards much more towards the kind of representative nature. However, I think what's really important to acknowledge at this stage of the EEG, particularly in sport, is there are lots of people doing it. It's a very new field. But there are kind of research that's been going on within it. But one of the challenges that we have is the consistency of research. So people will use maybe different epochs, and an epoch is the time duration that you look at from the start of the activity to the end of the activity. People will use different electrodes on the head, so that's the brain position. And some of that's linked to the equipment that you have. So we use different EEG equipment. And then some of us might use a different analysis process. So you've got the time frequency analysis, which to kind of really explain that very quite quickly is the
Hmm.
time is time. So when often in EEG research, you link that to the movement of the activity. So it might be the initiation of the backswing in golf. It might be the contact point. If it's shooting, it might be the initiation on the trigger. So you need a way of being able to timestamp in that movement to the EEG data. So you need to have the technology that enables you to really synchronize the movement with the brain activity.
Hmm.
Then also around that, you've got the frequencies. And I know this is something we kind of you've asked her to kind of give a little bit of a brief overview. And I think
Yeah, yeah.
what we tend to look at in sport is there's a couple of frequencies of you've got theta, which is 4 to 7, and that's the hertz. And you might think, oh, why those numbers? But the way I kind of explain it is around like radio frequencies and challenge. And when I said this to students the other day, they laughed at me because A, they don't tune in a radio anymore, and B, they just have digital. But even if you are tuning it in yourself or actually pressing the button on your screen, you say you've got radio one, that's one set of frequency. You've got radio two, another set of frequency, radio three, another set. So it's that same kind of analogy of where the different frequencies are linked to potentially what we might see happening in the brain or what we might expect to see. So you've got theta, you've got alpha, and we look at beta as well, which is all about motor preparation. So I think it's really nice that we've kind of got this ability to kind of think about what's happening in the brain and what might we look for in these certain
And
frequencies.
can I ask you to elaborate a bit more on that? Because I find it really interesting. So when we're talking about how you're able to categorize the sort of brain waves based on the sort of frequency range, can we talk then what is the profile that fits theta band, alpha band, beta band? What do each of them mean? What's the links back to performance? Is this a live thing? In what way do they occur? So could you chat a little bit more to that? Because that's something that's really interesting, I think.
Yeah, so I'm going to take one step back and
Yeah,
hopefully,
yeah.
but EEG is the way we measure this is it's measuring kind of brain activity, but one of the real kind of features of EEG is the temporal nature. So you can measure it in milliseconds. So you can get lots of data very, very quickly. Where if you were to put somebody in a scanner, say, it's fantastic for location, but it's not so good for frequency. It's not so good for that time. So what's really important is you pick the kind of your tool in order to what you're looking for. And in sport, what we know or what we can take our best guess at is that time matters. People make decisions quite quickly, or we would expect to be able to see time relative to milliseconds or even seconds. So it's having the technology that enables you to be able to do that. And that's what's really important when you link it back to the frequencies, because the frequencies are also related as well. So some of them are slower waves, some of them are fast waves. So you need to be able to have basically the ability to record that volume of data. So when it's amplified from the cap, from the electrode, so you create a really good connection, then that signal gets amplified. And that's when you might see on some of the, if you ever Google EEG, you see those black squiggly lines across the page.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what that is. So you take those raw black lines and then you do some really cool maths, a fast Fourier transform, and then that splits it into the frequencies. And from the frequencies, that we can then take our best guess based on years of kind of neuroscience research about what we might expect to see in those.
Frequencies. So, and
Yeah.
are the frequencies, and just try and help me understand this, Laura, as well. So, with the frequencies, is this how the brain waves are communicating? Is this like a sort of neural network that then allows, from the point of, I don't know, perception or sensory motor, whatever it is, in terms of how we take information in or decide on things, to then our muscles moving and doing the actions? What role do these brainwave frequencies actually play in performance then? So in terms of how do they talk to each other? How do they move in terms of the process?
Yeah,
If
so
that
I
makes
think
sense.
what's a good way of looking at it is it allows us to create like a distinct profile of what's happening if we do think about it to performance relative to success, relative to maybe a failure of a task. So so there is relationships between the bands, but there's also what you're looking for is how is that activity, what's happening in the brain basically at that particular time.
Okay.
And that's what's really kind of, so if you're looking at a motor preparation, you would expect to see like beta activity to create that motor. So I think it's about more thinking about what task are we doing? What would we expect to see frequency wise? And that's where the EEG literature is in sport is quite interesting because of potentially the different epochs or the different ways of analyzing the data, there is some consistency around kind of the neural efficiency framework, but there isn't necessarily. So some studies, if you just take golf putting, will say an increase is really good, and some studies might say a decrease is good. And this is
Mm,
in the activity in terms of the power. So I think what's fair to say at this point in the EEG research is we're really, and this is what the paper was about for us in the frontiers of why we kind of talked about the methodology. And there can't be
mm,
that many papers where we go from 28 participants to 12 participants because we were really keen on trying to reduce the signal to noise ratio to be clear, or at least say with a bit more certainty that what we thought we were collecting in terms of the brain activity was actually the brain activity we were collecting, because it's
mm,
quite easy to introduce noise into some of those situations. And I think that's what, in terms of looking at other research and kind of building from here, one of the things that I'm super keen that we do is that we start to have consistency both in the methods chosen, but down to the task, just as simple of,
mm,
do we ask them to actually put to a hole, or they put into a sticker on or they put, so consistency around, well, what's the potential window that we might look in terms of time? What's the electrodes, chosen, and why did we choose those? Because I think until we get that kind of level of consistency, it's quite hard then to think about how to train
mm.
this, because
Yeah.
without being able to say this is the pattern we would expect, and again, you'd want quite a lot of data to be able to back that up to show really consistent patterns. And I think at the minute, well, one thing for me was, for me, it's really understandable why there's these kind of differences, but not all of the papers say the same thing, which is kind of cool. That's what science is about, is trying to really understand what's going on. But
Yeah.
if we go back to the original task of putting, if we know putting performance is variable anyway, so you've got the world's best going from a 31 puts per round to a 27 puts per round in the same tournament, basically. So you've got the world's best who are quite variable on the performance. What we need to be sure of is that our measurement is robust enough to be able to capture what's potentially causing the variability.
It must be really tricky because I've delved into some of the literature, but whenever I'm looking at sort of skill acquisition type performance, looking at expert novice differences, all those sorts of things, you do notice that the methodologies can feel very distinct and different from other work, and that all often comes from a point of the investigator wanting to. I have a better way. Here's how to control more things, less kind of confounding variables. But then, if there isn't some level of standardization, it sounds like you're alluding to, and you aren't really able to properly combine that work in a way that can be really trusted in some respect, I suppose. But I'd imagine that's just a challenge then, isn't it? You're kind of looking for one paper to sort of lead the way then, and are others then going to kind of follow suit? Or what do you do? Is it a collection of work that's of similar standard that then we use that? I could see that straight away. I'm wondering, Laura, so with EEG as well, if you, because actually I've tried to, I'm glad that you used the abbreviation, because I've tried to pronounce the full spelling of this, and it's tough. I think my best attempt was, I think it was electrical. We've got, I had it here earlier on, but it's basically, I'd like you, yeah, electrical encephalogram. Okay. Could you, for a coach like me, explain what is that? What does that actually look like? Is this where you put the electrodes on their head and that's able to measure the stuff that's happening in terms of brain activity? Could you maybe just clarify that for me, just so that we know before we move forward what that actually entails?
Yeah, so the really hard word that neither you or I can pronounce. I often
I didn't
present
pass
with
the
one of my
test though.
colleagues who is from Cyprus, and it's got like it's Greek, it's from that origin. So I think
Is that?
it does help if you've got a bit more
These
proficiency in
things
the
are too
language
fancy.
skills.
They need to just
Yeah,
either we
so
stick with abbreviations or we just have a simpler term for it. I don't understand it. So
so the
yeah.
EEG is the very notion of the way we would use it is to put the cap on, and you have an amplifier on the cap, or sometimes in a backpack you see the wires coming down, and then you have some way of being able to transfer that to the laptop. And then also, like I say, what's really important in order to be able to synchronize it with the movement is you have a way of being able to synchronize it to the movement that you're interested in. So whether
Hmm.
that be in a lab study, that could just be a keyboard press, um, or whether in our case it's the golf putts. So you've got a way of being able to timestamp the movement that you're looking at to the activity, and that allows you to do the time frequency analysis and other analysis that you can do with the data. And obviously goes back to, for us, the key question of, is there a performance-based difference? In order for us to know whether there's a performance-based difference, we have to actually capture the motor activity.
Ah, okay. No, that's far clear. That makes a lot more sense.
But
And
there
you,
are plenty of people that say you put a band on or you do something like that, and that does collect neural activity.
uh,
But what it actually collects, I'm not always that sure. So I think it's being able to kind of really distinguish between what's going on in terms of what equipment are you using, how robust is that equipment. So for example, there's a really nice kind of study kind of in EEG. We know that if you close your eyes, you open your eyes, there should be really different, the signal should look different.
hmm.
So if you ever find a band that you put on, or some kind of technology that says it's going to measure your neuroactivity, if it doesn't show difference with eyes open and eyes closed, then I would kind of really question, is that going to reliably over time give you consistent data?
Ah, okay. No, thanks. That's a wee bit of a life hack there. I think as we're kind of entering a sort of technological age, I think coaching is becoming more and more influenced by technology. And I think it's just a really interesting insight that you're able to give us there. A lot of that in itself, before you even talk about the results and the findings, just understanding more about the experimentation aspect of your work so that coaches will sort of we just sort of unconsciously just assimilate information and recommendations that does come from these journal articles, from these papers, and it's good to know about the level. Actually, I don't say this as a means for why we should mistrust information, but actually rather why you really should see the level of scientific investigation that goes into these sorts of things, and it's just really interesting when you get to the sort of neuroscience aspect, the tools that you're using that then ultimately inform the conclusions that you came to with this work, which we are going to go into. You'd also mentioned, Laura, just for the purposes, just so that we understand the area in itself, that there seemed to have been quite a lot of work done previously around this idea that neuro efficiency frameworks, so, and that's sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's sort of coined under the assumptions on what expert performance looks like, because we often would associate it with like more automaticity, less sort of what you might say like brain activation in the sense of less active thinking, perhaps, stuff like task familiarity, because then we would have experienced it and there's an experience component to it, and just general in terms of the fatigue or the consumption of energy that might be used when an expert carries out these sort of very technical, complicated motor tasks compared to a more novice performer. How much of that is accurate? How much of that has played a role in the way your work was carried out? How have you taken that framework into your work before we then chat about the results? Just so that we can, I'd love for the guys that are listening, for the people that are listening to kind of get your understanding of that area.
Yeah, and I think the neural efficiency framework is something that, you know, it's way beyond sport. They found it across many kind of different areas. And again, going back to the design and the testing, a lot of those studies came from experts compared to novices.
Hmm.
So experts are definitely more efficient than novices. However, when we were coming to my kind of sample and this kind of idea of, I was working with performance level athletes. I wasn't interested whether they were different to novices. What I was interested in, how do I make an expert even better or a highly
Hmm.
skilled person even better? So I think the our hypothesis was in the paper was driven from some of the neural efficiency around this idea of that experts will have a level of kind of efficiency in their work in the because we know from their motor patterns the you know sometimes they're a lot more efficient. So it's quite logical to expect that you know experts are efficient. So it's something that we were kind of thinking, yes, we might be able to see that within the data, and that has been found in kind of previous EEG kind of studies as well, particularly within sport. But I'm always really interested in what sample. So I'm one of those
Hmm.
boring lecturers who go straight to the participants kind of section and have a look at who did they use, what level of skill were the people in the paper, and then what were
Hmm.
their experiences in terms of kind of how are we using that? And as a side, handicap is often used for golf putting skill, but we found the handicap's quite a poor predictor of golf putting performance because handicap makes up all of the aspects of the game. So are the different ways of being able to figure out who is your better inverted commas putters within the task that you're doing or outside of that.
And does because it's an interesting point, because I often, you do see those studies, and most studies do have that the difference between experts and novice. If is there in some sense like they could be universes apart sometimes in the way that they do things? Does it always lend itself? And I wonder if this has any connection that you'd mentioned there about looking at participants and really understanding who is in the study and how expert, how novice are they? Is there a possibility that if we aren't careful about really understanding who this sort of work's done on, these expert to novice comparisons don't really help with really understanding the bits between. Because like as much as they'll tell you glaring differences, they might not be able to necessarily tell you developmental differences and as such an exact way. I don't know, because and then the flip side, when you mentioned, and please come, I want to come back to what you're thinking about that, but in the flip side, you also mentioned about trying to help experts become more experts. There's been some work, not necessarily in this area, but it's just in terms of, I'm starting to see some work now talk about the super elite and the difference between them and the normal elite. And that sort of, it's got me thinking back to that sort of work. And it's kind of like, well, how do experts become even better? Not just how are experts, how they are. And then we've also got the other side, as I mentioned just at the start, there's a big gap sometimes between what we consider a novice and an expert, and how helpful is that in terms of, are they too big? Are they too small? Or does it not matter? It's just what are you thinking about any of that? You're making me consider that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think there's value in the expert to novice because I think it really helps to develop the theory. It helps to develop our understanding of what might, you know, what
Mm,
might be some of
hmm
the markers. But I think it ultimately for me, it comes back to what population are you trying to apply your findings in?
Mm,
And if you are kind of working with experts, one thing I really believe about experts is they are quite different to each other. So the
mm,
problem for me with experts being a group on their own, um, and that group is all mean together compared to the group mean average of the novice, what we get is this idea that kind of maybe all experts are the same. But
mm,
maybe I just look at the world slightly differently, and I'm quite happy to be told that. But I genuinely believe, and one of the things that I find most exciting about working with really highly skilled people is that there is that level of individuality, that they are different. So I do think we will find similarities. Of course, I'm not saying that, but I
mm,
think one of the things that's really important is particularly eventually, and I say eventually in the EEG world, that we want to go down to recommendations for interventions for coaches and individual players, that there's a real nature of how do we understand the experts that we've got and how do we kind of look at them as individuals in their own right. And that's a real challenge when you come to stats and research and
mm,
p-values, and it's a whole different story for a different day. I think we've got to get better at single base and case study design and things like that to really kind of drill out those. But that research takes time. It's longitudinal
mm,
research. It takes a lot of investment from the coach, from the sport, from the in this case the golfer themselves, and it it's a very long process. And I think it's ultimately every nobody goes into research without having a purpose of why they were going to do that research, and everyone
mm,
goes with the aim to whether that's to have developed theoretical knowledge or whether that's to improve, in my case, hopefully performance. So I think it's really tying the methods that you're doing, the questions that you want to ask, the analysis that you're going to do to the question that you want to have. And I think if we go back to the paper, the Frontiers paper, we started as a very basic of, can we see a distinctive neural like difference? So is there a difference in the brain activity for successful puts versus unsuccessful puts? Now, you could be really critical of the fact that we defined a put on hits or miss. We didn't use radial error. We didn't use distance from the hole. Now, there's lots of research that suggests that just looking at percentage puts is too blunt of a measure. But we weren't looking at a learning study in this case. So and because the put was from 8 feet and it's roughly 40 to 50%, that's the probability rate that they're looking at. We wanted to kind of really trying to push that performance element, understanding that it might be quite a crude measure. So like it's not that I'm not acknowledging that that is a fair kind of criticism of the work, but it was
mm,
reasons behind, again, why do you do it, what you're interested in, and that's what we were quite keen to find. And I think that was probably one of the most exciting parts for us, is that there was observable differences based on success within experts.
mm.
So, and I think it comes full circle of kind of all the conversation we've had so far is we took an expert sample, we looked at them and said, could we find differences between successful and unsuccessful within their own performances?
That's actually really unique because it's kind of looking at that subpopulation, not as the gold standard, but actually as their own little culture and their own space, because I think if you asked any expert as well, in terms of how you want the work to serve the athlete ultimately, they're going to tell you they want to get better as well, probably. They're probably going to still talk about that stuff, and maybe they don't see themselves often in the work that is more positioned towards the learning of skills, maybe, or I don't know if that's even the right word to say, but more the novice population. So I could see for coaches that could be listening that are working with already expert athletes, how can they get them better? I could see this filling a space there for them
Mm-hmm.
because they're then able to see their own population identified and importantly the motivations of their own population and get better also sort of catered to insofar as like where the work's trying to go. So that's really cool. So if you look at the methods then, and you had in terms of your population, it was was it 28 expert amateur golfers. You fitted them with it was like a gel-based EEG that you'd
Yeah.
used. So then essentially what were the outcomes then? So you'd measured the sort of the putt success rates. Take us then to the results. What did you find? How can we differentiate across or within rather this group of athletes?
Yeah, and I think the findings this is one of those really nice papers where the title reflects the findings. So commit to your stroke is something is something that we found through if we go through the beta, so the motor preparation. So for the successful shots, people started their motor preparation earlier, so they had an earlier onset. And when we go back to that efficiency, this earlier suppression and longer suppression is not actually more efficient. However, when you think about it in terms of enhanced preparation, because if we use it in kind of a coach term, like they locked in the motor program and they stuck with it, that is efficient, because they had efficient
Hmm.
preparation. They picked what it was they were going to do and they just stuck with it and they really committed. So that's where that title of commit to your stroke came from, because those that had this enhanced preparation, we were using the beta to kind of that's where we came from to say this is where this enhanced preparation was coming from, were much more likely to have success. On the flip
Hmm.
side of that, if we then had a look at the last half a second before the put, if it was unsuccessful, what we saw was this increase in theta, which is really not efficient. And this was linked to kind of like hesitation or a change in motor plan. So it was like anyone who plays golf, or I think anyone who does kind of sport, understand this in terms of, especially for something that has got a pre-performance routine, you're over the ball and you're like, okay, I've got to do it now. And suddenly you're like, oh no, I don't want to do that one. I need to rethink it.
Hmm.
So that hesitation comes in, or you try it, but you kind of, in golf, what often happens, people try and force it and try and control the part of the putt rather than kind of
Yeah.
letting it go. So I think we often that hesitation just before you're about to you start the movement, or just as the movement started, the initiation of the movement, we found that wasn't great for the success of the putt. But again, it's quite nice because it's not that surprising of a finding. If you hesitate just before you're about to go, or just as you're starting the movement activity, that doesn't normally end well from a coaching perspective.
And does that speak to the sort of like constrained action hypothesis, or sort of like, our body wants to work sort of in autopilot mode, so if we try to kind of override the systems, then it becomes too mechanical, and it sounds like that hesitation starts to perhaps, I know we're sort of, this is a bit pathological now, but I'm thinking about the connections to your work and some of the previous literature that, where you have experts and maybe they've hesitated, they've thought too much about it, they start to almost override that system, or even worse, they try and kind of reinvest prior knowledge about what to do because they're trying to just control too many things, and they become less expert in their moments. We talk all the time about sort of like choking and things like that. Is that sort of, does that link up with this sort of thing, or
I
is it,
suppose
do you try to keep them separate in the way that you're investigating this?
I think trying to really link the two and the mechanisms across, I think I would much rather see a study on that and kind of before I give a concrete answer. But I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
this notion of hesitation, what causes that hesitation, I'm not sure right now, because it could
Hmm.
be emotional, like it could be any kind of part of it in terms of, so what causes that? To be seen, we'll go and do
Yeah,
some
yeah.
next research. But I think the notion of it we saw that link to unsuccessful performance. And I think that's
Uh,
quite, and we didn't see that hesitation at all linked to successful performance. So this idea of if you know what you're doing, you're able to commit to it, you just get on with it.
hmm.
I would kind of much rather stay in that zone, because it's from a coaching point of view as well. It's probably something you've said time and time again. And as a player, I think you would probably always understand that yourself of, and often lots of people say it's just easy. When things are going well, it's easy.
Yeah, no, but even that itself, even just knowing that there's a correlation with hesitation, and I think what you'd said, it was that the increased theta band,
Mhm.
the one that's responsible at that point for like error detection and sort of that sort of thing. And that maybe plays a role in why there's less successful shots in the moments, because we're constantly trying to then kind of rework things, and we're just focusing too much on different plans and not committing to it. What was there any sort of time condition to this? So see, in terms of where we're committed to a decision, was there any relationship in terms of how long players perhaps were taking to decide on their putt, to then committing to it, to then seeing differences then in performance? I would wonder, does time play a role in any of this sort of stuff? Like you see sometimes golfers where, or any, I would kind of take it back to my own sport, like a football, maybe standing over a free kick or whatever. Sometimes the actual time it spans, the expansion of time leads itself to more thought, but is there a level there that we need to correct or get right? I don't know. I just wondered if that showed up in the results at all. Um,
Yeah, a couple of things to kind of really help explain because
yeah,
some of that was our methodological. So we said you've got 40 seconds because that's the rule
40
of golf.
seconds. Ah,
So
okay.
that's what they're allowed to take.
Yeah,
However, the
okay.
EEG, where we found the differences, um, we kind of used the data to go through and we kind of created epochs on those data. So where I'm talking about the differences now is in that final 3 seconds before
Ah,
contact.
okay. Yeah.
And so it's that consistent period. So there might well have been different timings in that 40 seconds of how long they spent to read the putt or how long they spent to kind of regulate themselves in order to start the movement. But one of the things I probably should have said earlier about EEG is you need to be still. So it doesn't really like movement. So you
Mm,
don't need to be still, but it's much easier if the person is still. So we tend to do quite a lot of the EEG from address. So when both feet are still, and that then really allows us to be able to have, again, thinking about that signal to noise ratio, because when people are moving, they're using their muscles and everything to move. So if we
mm,
filter out all of that, then we're not. So there are people who do EEG on walking. There's some people who've even done EEG on cycling and running. So it's not that necessarily, you can't do it with movement, but it's much more accurate if you do it without. And that's where the traditional kind of lab study came in with you only moving your key, with the finger press, because
yeah.
there was such limited movement there. So we could be surer of the signal. So again, it just comes back to, again, we're going to sound like we're on a methods hunt here, but the decisions you make in the methodology, the
Mm,
decisions you make with the epoch that you use and why, and that then looks at. So, but I think for the coaches and the kind of the like more practical side of this is that it's quite cool that we can see differences in the last 3 seconds. Like
yeah, yeah.
that's like, and also it allows people, going back to what I talk about, that individuality. It kind of means that if you need to take 20 seconds to read or 20 seconds to regulate yourself, do that. Like we can have some freedom in that temporal part of it.
Also, it didn't discriminate. So if I take 30 seconds to judge what I'm doing versus a minute, your work's suggesting that
We
doesn't
only had
necessarily
the 40
matter.
seconds. So yeah,
So
they could only take
the
the 40
only 40
seconds.
cents. Yeah.
But we only analysed the last three. So we have no clue what was
Uh,
going on in the
but
brain in the
would that show, Laura, then that if you're allowing up to 40 seconds, some people might use the full duration, other people maybe didn't use as much, but you were still able to get results that showed different relationships and putting success. So that kind of shows, does that show to some extent, if you need more time, you can take it, but once you commit in those seconds right up to it, that's where it matters. Is that kind of, or is that
Yeah,
stretching it a
because
little
we
bit?
didn't, I suppose we didn't capture how much time people took as long as they didn't take the
Ah,
40,
okay.
as long as they didn't go over. But I think
Okay.
the critical part is that what you do in those final parts
The
matter.
final parts matter.
So
And
once you
does,
commit,
yeah, and does that have, so you mentioned that we kind of want people to be still. So this idea of committing to your decision, does that, can that apply? So I'm thinking all the time about sort of transferable, recommendations to some degree. I know that it's this was a study set in golf. Obviously, it's bounded to some extent with the parameters of golf and those sorts of things. But could a coach who is maybe trying to instruct a player on better free throws in basketball, or a coach that's a football guy like myself is maybe trying to help an athlete understand, a player understand what to think about, where to place the ball during a free kick? Is there transferability there, or do we need to bound this to golf more strictly?
I think personally, because obviously I research golf, I'm going to be a
Yeah,
lot more certain to say, these findings we found in golf.
yeah, I know. Yeah, of course.
But I think when we think about it more broadly, if you then think about it as just the headlines, you
Hmm.
know, does committing to your free kick before you do it, so knowing what type if you want to bend it over the wall or whatever that might be,
Yeah.
and making that decision and then sticking to it, that might be a cool starting point of even asking the footballers before they go of what was your intention and did you stick to it or did you change it?
Yeah,
Like, and
yeah.
without doing EEG, like, because we don't know for the EEG, and I think given that there's quite a lot of differences within the literature that's been done already, I'm not sure how ready we are for the transferability. But
Hmm.
from a very practical point of view, asking someone to set an intention and did you commit to your intention or did you change?
Hmm.
And then have a look at what happens to performance. I think it's a good starting point to
Yeah, yeah.
like conducting maybe your own little mini experiment.
Yeah, I always think, and it's quite refreshing to hear that, because I always think sometimes that not the unscientific way, but the human sort of way of understanding what sometimes is conducive to performance is just exploration of process, and where maybe as it stands, this is still an emerging area of work. Um, we're still looking to see more and maybe try to see where it could be replicated across different sports. If it's a conversation starter that perhaps a coach might have with the player, or at least a coach should encourage a player to understand the process a little bit more, not in a way to paralyze through analysis, but to just get them more attuned to, I think you said, the intentional aspect
Mm.
of behavior, then that in itself is a real benefit. I think in a meantime, like that's still really, really strong. And it's just interesting when you see the way a lot of skill acquisition or performance-based work we can very strictly interpret it based purely in the context it's positioned within, but we also need to be surely we need to allow ourselves to have our minds open to the idea that it could also have transferable benefit, just maybe in the way that it's modified to fit another context, not saying in a kind of copy and paste fashion, but that we can take the learning from it. Like I certainly could feel quite confident about trying to get an athlete or a player to think about commitment to shot or to tell me about what they're doing in the moments. And I think what your work offers, it's just further language, isn't it? It's further conversation points that we can sit and touch on and sit back with and reference. And I think that's really cool. I just wonder in terms of where you want the work to go. Actually, before we even get, well, actually, yeah, if you want to answer that question, Laura, in terms of where you want the work to go next, because it's a starting point, and now obviously we're talking about maybe different sports, or do you see this as actually no, we need to understand it more in the context of golf and then move it outside? What would you ideally like to see happen next?
Well, I think for me, I would like to kind of see that like the same study done a few times over with like a
Hmm.
similar population, maybe in different cross culturals as well. So we've got those because I would like to see a lot more kind of consistency in the data before we get to training interventions. Because
Hmm.
ultimately, I'm a practitioner at heart. I want to get to the training interventions, but
Hmm.
I always remember the quote, and I think it was Dan Bishop who said this, is if you're going to get someone to change what to do they're doing, you have to be sure that the change that you're asking them to do is better than what they're currently doing. And I
Hmm.
think for me, I think it's really important when we're asking someone, particularly around if we are talking about preparation, which is so personal, to think, right, okay, are we sure? Are we really like within the best that
Hmm.
we can, that the information and the recommendations that we're going to give is going to make a change better than what they're currently doing already? And that's
Hmm.
something that I will always kind of live by. And I think there is some really good neurofeedback studies that are really starting to emerge right now, but everything feels really quite new, and I think it's an exciting time to be part of. Like, there's plenty of people who came before me who've done a great job, and there'll be plenty of people after me. But for me, it's about really trying to see this as the emergent field that it is, but try and build some of that consistency amongst what we're trying to do and some of those methods so that we
Hmm.
can have a clearer narrative, especially I think off the backdrop of there's very it's very commercial this area, so there's lots of products that claim that they measure brain activity. So I think they look good, they're marketed well, you get a really cool app on your phone, and some of them are really cool, and some of them have some real
Hmm.
good like scientific rigor. But as a coach, trying to disseminate which one, or and say, which one's a good one, which one's not a good one, I think we almost need to do a better job of scientists of kind of really helping people work through that.
So if we are being sensible then in terms of I go along tonight in my training session and I maybe carry some of the lessons forward around commitment to a shot. If we're being sensible, there is also first an awareness of, does the athlete actually require a modification to what they're doing? Sometimes that's an involuntary thing, still modification. It's like, through injury, we have to readapt the way we do things. Other times, maybe more in the context of the athletes that you've been working with, Laura, where they are already expert in a lot of regards. It's then about them getting better. But we still, modification always kind of comes a dip in performance, doesn't it, as well, because they have to change how they're doing things, and that might necessitate a drop in performance. I know this is more like a commitment and a psychological thing, but at that, if for some people they can't, depending on the timing of the season, or where there's a competition, they can't afford to change how they're doing things. So maybe in their moments, it's maybe pitting the best times. Is that maybe and even if we're adding detail to this recommendation, it's being sensible about when you try and impart that knowledge, and in what circumstances you try and channel that thought for the athlete. Does that make that's just starting to come out for me a little bit?
Yeah, I think with any of this is that, like, if you're asking people to talk to you about their process and you're asking them to talk about the intentionality, and if you are going down the skill refinement route, like for me, I was personally just talking about process and kind of not necessarily
Yeah.
modifying the technique at all, because I
Uh,
don't tend to
but like
look
I
at
see it
any.
almost as sort of together. I feel like the
Yeah,
physical
yeah.
execution and the process of what you're saying, they go together to some extent, the way I'm thinking.
I think there's definitely a link, isn't there, of how you kind of carry on an activity. Like if we go with the hesitation, if you then feel yourself trying to control the movement, or you're not sure what to do, so you might actually take some of the pace off it because you're scared that
Mm,
you might overhit or whatever. I think those are the things I would tend to try and avoid. And then in this
mm,
other idea is around like almost putting trust in, if you've set your attention, you commit to it, you will see what happens and then you evaluate it. And in golf, like I was saying, it's really complex. There could be many variables, but it's that
mm,
way of being able to evaluate it with your coach and have a conversation. But at least you've got something to evaluate in terms of, did you do what you think you did? And going back at the beginning of, when you're on, what is it that you do? And when you're not so good, what is it that you do? And how do you help people have those conversations? So
mm,
the gap between kind of, I'm amazing, I'm not so good, isn't something that because to try and manage that for a round of golf, that is one heck of a roller coaster in a really
mm,
challenging situation. So helping people to be able to maybe recognize earlier, or helping people to be able to trust themselves. So to, commit, like go for it, see what happens.
mm. So no, I completely agree. So what I'd like to bring us back to the results just for a moment again, because one of the things I wanted to touch on with you was there was one surprising result you mentioned in the paper around the alpha band. So that's in terms of fitting the profile around like attention and sort of arousal control, that didn't seem to play. What was it? It didn't seem to play a role, perhaps, in the differences in shot success. Can you speak to that a little bit more? Why do you think that might have been the case? Does that have any? Is that a surprise in terms of, does it compare to other work? What can we take from that? Um, yeah, really helpful to know about.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for me. I was going to mention that in terms of it was a surprise because it didn't fit the neural hypothesis, because that's where you tend to find with the kind of efficiency, definitely, that you see differences. I think there's a big conversation around alpha. So alpha is the one band in sport that's been researched more than any other, really.
Oh, okay.
It's quite a popular kind of band. But in golf, there has been inconsistency. Some studies have found an increase, some studies have found a decrease. But again, going back to my earlier point, it's really hard to compare the studies because there's differences within the methodology. So
Hmm.
the fact that we didn't find a performance-based difference, again, we're not the only people to have found that, but I think it's just quite surprising that there isn't, again, consensus around how alpha, so we know it's got a link somehow. you know
Hmm.
we know it's got a role to play. And I think in the paper we even had a look at doing the splitting the alpha band up into low and high, because it is linked to different functions. But I think the massive caveat behind our study is we only ended up with 12 people in the sample. So I think
Mhm.
in the real honesty is it was 12 people. So I think one of the things that I always talk about when I think about this paper is it's a starting point. We showed this real methodology of being able to use two different EEG analysis techniques in the same paper. We use this really quite strict methodology in terms of how we process the data. Now we want to just do more of it, so we can start to understand. So that's why, there's a section in the paper that says we honestly don't feel like we're ready to provide any practical recommendations. What
Mm.
this allows us to do is more kind of shine a light on the methodology and say, what do we think for this moving forwards for sport, and to kind of have much more of that rigor in order to be able to try and hopefully explain in a few years' time what's going on with alpha.
Okay, so that was, yeah, it's just that maybe there wasn't a mechanism to measure it, or at least to compare it to prior work so that you can see if that was happening or wasn't
Yeah.
happening, and then
And with
you have a
12
better
people,
understanding.
like it's,
Yeah.
we can't really say we've got a representative sample with 12 people.
But that's always the hard part, but isn't it? These studies are so complicated to do that even getting 12 people is an achievement itself, isn't it? So that's just the nature of this sort of work. And it shows perhaps the potential if it was to be replicated elsewhere. I think you mentioned more longitudinal work, if that would make a difference in that respect as well. So,
Because then
um,
we'd have the same golfer in the same, can you imagine tracking? Because this was just one session as well. So
yeah.
the idea would be is because the applied world is one golfer, multiple sessions, over and over. So that's what we really need to get to is how does the person, and again, the variability I talk about from a performance point of view, that isn't within the same day. It's almost across the different days of how I talk.
Mm.
So again, really what I would want to go into is this longitudinal session, multiple sessions with the same person. Do we find that consistency in results?
And did we'd mentioned earlier on about the neuro efficiency framework and some of the sort of what that posits insofar as like this really efficient sort of economical way of in which sort of expert performers go through the motions, and did that did your results does it, some of the reading and the writing in around your results suggested maybe that it wasn't that it went against that, but it just didn't there seemed to be a bit more nuance that I wonder if you could speak to a little bit around how much it holds up that framework when it was applied to the sample that you used in terms of overall level of taxation, cognitively speaking. Do performers, do they struggle in that way, in the way that the model would suggest, or is it slightly different? What should you maybe speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, so our theta findings definitely were in line with what you would expect from the neural efficiency.
So
And then
yeah.
you had the alpha, which we didn't, they're not in line. We didn't find a difference. So, and then the beta was interesting. So the the beta in terms of the neural activity, so the enhanced suppression, that wouldn't suggest the person's more efficient. But this idea of enhanced preparation, that alludes to efficiency. And then I think with the MRCPs, we did link that back to the neural efficiency as well. So I think I like the way you describe it. There's nuances within it, and I think that's an interesting way of looking at it in terms of because there's some really good work out there from Bartolo, and they talk about proficiency for experts. So it's effortful, like it is
Hmm.
hard work to keep that level of intensity. It doesn't. So I think it's thinking about that idea of efficiency doesn't equal easy.
Uh,
Um, so I know, and Bartolo talks about proficiency, and he talks about this idea of doing the right thing at the right time. So I think, when we think about sport more generally, I think there's a long way we can be to really try and work out what would be the best profile.
hmm.
But I think efficiency has definitely got to be part of it because you're with experts, but also there's that moment of time and place. Like you
Hmm.
have to, and that effort that comes with consistently doing the right thing at the right time.
So it's kind of like effortful efficiency, and I suppose it kind of speaks to you. I mean, right at the start, we spoke about the need to individualize things a little bit more and start to recognise that everyone has their own individual profile, we can obviously try to see and establish correlations, but maybe it's like the way in which these bandings sort of show themselves and manifest performer to performer can change slightly, and the weighting of intensity and the weighting of effort changes, even if they each have a certain amount of efficiency in that respect. So it's like everything. I think everything's complicated, and it's only so much you can measure for in one study. That's why, and you'll have to forgive me, because I know that you're very clear-eyed in the way that you're thinking. And but me as a coach, I'm trying to. That's why I'm bringing in all these other arguments, because I'm trying to link things together. And that I wonder, what do you think about that as a I don't know if it's a problem as such, but coaches will it's very difficult, I think, in coaching to see any one thing in isolation. Just, and for good reason, sometimes you're having to not just think about the neuroscience, but also the emotional issues that that can impact performance, the physical in terms of muscular issue, it could be so many other factors. How how do coaches take in information like this while still being able to pay attention to other things at the same time? 'Cause this is where it's always complicated, because I think the recommendations that you have to make in still acquisition or still learning, or these types of experimental works, they have to be so bounded because there's so many things that weren't controlled for, or this and that. But how does the average Joe, how does the average coach that wants to utilize this work, what would be your recommendations for how to approach these pieces of work and integrate it within their existing schema? Because our existing schemas is just there's a colossal amount of other sorts of fields of thought. And this does really speak to the art form or maybe the philosophy of coaching, that I actually think we need to be a bit more allowing, because I think philosophy and coaching's far more practical in a lot of times than sometimes being overly scientific. But we need to have both. What do you think to any of that? I just would like to know do you think coaches should how should coaches encounter your work, read your type of work, and use your type of work in a way that's practical for them?
Okay, so I'll answer this in two different ways.
Yep.
So the first one in terms of the technology led, I think it's being honest about being technology informed, but the technology is not making the decisions. We as
Mm,
the people behind that are using the data to make informed decisions. And that for me is a conversation between, the researcher, the coach, like the golfer themselves, everyone to kind of say what's happening here. And the data, the technology gives you some level of objectivity, and it helps you to see what you might not ordinarily be able to see in the conversation. So it might look like we were saying earlier, they're doing the same behavior,
hmm
but something different's going. And you may or may not be aware of that as a golfer. And obviously, one of the things I often talk about is when people, if you go back to your situation about pressure, some people say, oh, I handle pressure really well. And some people say, oh, I don't handle it at all. But equally, some people go really fast, some people slow down, some people change. Sometimes they go really fast and then they know they can only go really fast, so they try to go really slow and they do something completely different.
hmm
But I think it's that idea of, and this is how I link to the second part of my conversation, is you're a coach, right? What coaches do really, really well is have good conversations, have insightful conversations, be curious. So I think if you're building your relationship or maintaining your relationship with the athlete, this is about like non-judgmentally what's happening for you, whether, and that's why I really like tracking performance over time, track it so you can
hmm
have a look to see if there's any patterns or there's any trends in that. Not day by day, session by, you can track it day by day, session by session, shot by shot. But I
hmm
think it's important to take the shot by shot stuff in a session and combine that sometimes to say, okay, well, how are you at that? So, because you as a coach know what else you're trying to do in
mm,
that block of work. So, I
yeah.
think for me, going through those patterns and trends, are you seeing the progression you would expect to see with the player? If you're not seeing it, okay, no, not necessarily being super judgmental of why you're not seeing it, but be really curious about, okay, what might be going on? Or if you're really struggling with a particular skill, Like, what is it that you can do to them? And so I think the technology does help to have some of those conversations, particularly when you guys as coaches and athletes get stuck in the conversation and you feel like you're going around in
Mm,
circles. But I think as a practical recommendation, I think some of this is around having that ability to be able to have conversations with the athlete around what is it that you're trying to do. Not, saying, oh, well, you didn't follow your process there, so it doesn't matter. Where go and follow your process. It's like, okay, well, if you're genuinely trying to follow your pre-performance routine and you can't, or it's not working, let's have a conversation about kind of why do you feel that urge to change what it is you're about to do just 2 minutes before? Like, what's stopping you from being able to like stick to your intention? Like, again, that's really
mm,
interesting information to be able to gather, but the massive caveat for me, time.
mm,
So just before someone's about to go to a major competition or anything like that is why would you unpick, like, unless you really need to unpick what they're doing.
mm,
And if they're not self-aware already, being careful to build that self-awareness, because again, it might feel like you're watching them and judging them, even though that wasn't your intention. So I think it's, you know, as coaches, have really good conversations, build that trust and rapport that you do so well, but be aware of what is it that you're asking the athlete to do.
mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree, and it probably speaks to the value of sort of localized experimentation, like you mentioned. Like, it doesn't need to just be out of journals. Obviously, of course, we need to trust in a very scientific, professionally led research article. We need to take that with a lot of merit. But there's nothing to say that an imperfect locally done research project that I've done with my own athletes where I'm interrogating my own practice, but while being able, as I do that, to stay in touch with all the sort of idiosyncrasies of my own coaching process, of their own performance, that won't still lead itself to very fruitful conversations, or at the very least fruitful conversations, might even be interventions that, again, they won't be perfect. It comes back to, however, the philosophy aspect of coaching and try to make these decisions where we have to constantly look at the tensions between things, and where even there, even where there doesn't seem to be links, we need to see links. And sometimes I find it more comfortable to look for links between things than I do at times to see things in isolation. But does that maybe speak then? I think when we look at even a coach's formal learning, I don't really think coaches are taught outside of a university setting. I don't think we're really taught about experimentation and about interrogation of things within a practice. That I don't think the scientific method is really accessible to coaches and more vocational training courses. I think that's perhaps where a university education and coaching has a lot of merit and a lot of value for that. And I don't always just talk about that as I'm not just being the cheerleader for university education, but it is true. I think when you say that, it just connects a lot more with me. Like, we do applied projects or different things like that, and it's about keeping it in your environment. Um, I want to ask this, and you need to forgive me, because I'm going to ask you now a question that does link this to another area. A lot of coaches, if we're thinking about this motor learning philosophy, again, we're looking to sometimes see where there can, if we want to have effortful, intentional practice as a coach, as best I can, I want there to be harmony between the things that I do. And I'm wondering, when we look at things like committing to your shot, um, can that be linked to other aspects around sort of attentional control, or is it indeed even just when we look at the different camps that sometimes we exist within, where we feel like performance and learning is like information process led, or it's more ecological? How does this work fit in any, or where could it be positioned within the arguments? Can it be, is it universal? Is it actually something that's separate from that? And because we're looking at just brain activity, we're not necessarily seeing a channel of which that process actually exerts itself. So we don't need to we can attach either philosophy or thought to it. I'm interested in that conversation because it's constantly brought up, the ecological approach versus that, how performance is created. And when we get a suggestion here that's, we need to think about committing to our shots, and we're starting to think, does it play a role there as well? Or even speaking speculatively, I just would be interested to know your opinion. You can tell me to shut up as well. You can say, no, don't talk about that video that you say that, but I'm just reaching a little bit.
I think the same things that you see play out in sport around, cognition and being at your school of, and then the same with kind of ecological dynamics. We see very, very similar, you've got the embodied cognition, you've got the cognitive. So there's lots of different approaches. And for me,
Mm,
it always comes back to what are you trying to do in your research design? So if you are asking someone to press a keyboard, so watch something, it might be anticipation on a screen and their response is a keyboard press, that gives me an indication of potentially what philosophy that person's kind of coming from, because they're
mm,
not necessarily interested in the action itself. They're interested in the what happens before the action. So I think for me, I think what's really important in all of this is that it's when we come to explain some of these decisions, I think we are biased. We will set up an experiment or we'll set up our coaching, whatever that might be, based on the way that we see and think about the world.
mm.
And I think when we're doing that, I think it's important to consider, like I'm always going to consider the interaction between the task and the environment and the individual they are. But I think what's important is to really think about when you are then making decisions off the back of that data, why are you making those decisions? And I think that's where those, like I say, the same arguments play out within kind of neuroscience, but it comes back to what is it that you're trying to do with that research? What is it that you're trying to answer? How is it going to be applied? Who's going to apply that information? And I think it's not necessarily giving you an answer per se, but I think
Hmm.
it's an it depends answer, because the way people set up their experiment is probably based on the philosophy that they work from. So
Yeah.
it's really difficult to be able to say, you know, can we look at it non-biased? No, because
Mm,
the way people set up their experiments, the way that people analyze the data, what features of the data that they look at often will come from a theoretical starting point, because you need that in order to be able to go and approach the data. So
mm.
I think the best thing we can do in the space is really reflect on what our own perspective is and like what we're anticipating from the data.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? And I would probably say that we're, and I would include myself in this. I think I'm sometimes too quick to mistrust the experimental sort of fallacy that just it's basically it comes out of the innate bias that is going to be in all experiments. But I suppose that when we look at this work, it's kind of like how we need to train our ability to evaluate work, not necessarily blame the work for how it was set up, because as you say, where it's not so much sort of uh, naturalistic sort of functional, work where it's been built in practice and there's these sort of things in that. Obviously, therefore, there's an element of there's still value in that, and it's just maybe looking at underlying processes, where the work can achieve both things even better. But then it's just about how we can actually take that in and sort of consider it. I mean, and again, in terms of looking at these things in a philosophy viewpoint, where I see this sort of work, Lauren, and I think a lot of coaches would look at it, is, well, the moments. And I always think about that in terms of the moments of performance. This is a moment where there is time available, where there's a dead ball opportunity, golf, wherever. And it's that sort of slow thought versus sort of fast thought situations where the time is different, requires different sorts of actions, and then name itself requires maybe different processes. And again, I know some people might argue, no, it's not, it's the same. But maybe it's just we don't know fully. We're still trying to investigate a lot of those things. So, but I do think what I find really valuable about your work is it's given certainly a really interesting insight into the slow think opportunities, and how we actually, maybe take advantage of that, how we can get the most out of that. What does optimal performance show, and the neuroscience aspects just really, really interesting, because now we're seeing inside the head. Um, and that isn't, we don't see a lot of that. So That's really, really well done. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Laura, in terms of like what we've spoke about so far? Because I think I've asked most of the questions I have, but just in case there's something that's came up just earlier on that you want to touch on, just to give you that opportunity just now.
No, I'm grand.
No,
That was
brilliant.
a really good conversation. And I know you're trying to link it, and I really appreciate my brain does try and link things as well. But I think it's that idea of where we are, what we're trying to do. So, like I say, for me, my research is about the self-paced nature, and I think that's really cool. We can use EEG in a multiple different ways, but I think
Mm,
it always comes back to what are you trying to do? Where's that information going to end up? Like, what's the limits of the of your research experiment? And I think it's, by having this conversation, by having coaches even know that this exists, that you can actually, you can go into a situation, you can start to start thinking about observable differences in the brain. I think sometimes coaches go, that's what I've been saying for years to people, and now we've got a reason for it, which is kind of quite nice from my perspective of it, that we're finding studies that coaches have been saying for years, but without necessarily having the scientific backing of why that works. And now we might be, we need a lot more research, but we might start to get indication of why it works session after session after session, and why it might fall down in those situations. That's something
mm,
that, for me, it's for the future to carry on. And I feel like we're in a nice time for EEG research because it's got a history, but it's kind of still in its infancy to really start to think, what do we want to do with sports EEG research? Because it is by far like one of the, like you say, you're interested in it because it's cool. And it's
yeah,
also cool
yeah.
because it brings some of the unknown into our known kind of, we can start having conversations about it. So I think,
Well,
yeah, we've
well,
we've got
well,
great
Laura,
responsibility.
that is one. That's your last question because you have brought up a couple of times, and I've just been waiting. Actually, I was just reminding myself there to ask about it. Is that because it's cool, because it's interesting? There's a marketable aspect to it, and I think you'd mentioned a few things there around like equipment and things maybe that coaches could be purchasing, more clubs, organisations. Just I wonder in this sort of technological boom, there's probably going to be more and more things presented to coaches that claim to offer access to this sorts of insights. Do we need to be wary of that then? Is there certain things, because you mentioned about what technology, what good technology should be able to show, what maybe in some signs to maybe show maybe you haven't got the best equipment? Because I don't know if there's going to be apps eventually, or maybe there is already these sorts of like, you know, applications or equipment that's trying to become accessible, maybe in the cost or whatever. But do we need to be wary about how we use them because they're shiny, but maybe they don't have the validity that we would hope for? What's this space like insofar as equipment, access, marketing, that sort of aspect?
Yeah, and I would, again, I'm going to answer this in two ways. It seems to be the
Yeah.
two-way answer today. But so we have BCI, which is like computer automated. It knows the signal, it knows what it's looking for. It can analyze the data very, very quickly, and you can train the data, and it can get more smart. However, in order for BCIs to be super effective, it needs to be a really known, reliable pattern that it's looking for. Now, when we go back to the picture of sport, one of the things that I'm really wanting to advocate for is, can we create a clear picture, please?
Hmm.
um, can we create some of that consistency? And then you can really let AI, BCI, all of that kind of take its merry way. And you could potentially be able to do that a lot more real time. And also, coaches will probably be able to do that on an app. However,
Hmm.
where we are now is, this is really, you get a lot of data, and I mean a lot of data. It's a skill set in itself to learn how to interpret the data, how to process the data, how to code.
Hmm.
All of that is a skill set within itself, and it takes time. And it's something, so again, I can't kind of really emphasize the detail. We had 28 participants. We threw out, so we had 12 because we
Hmm.
were so strict on the signals that we wanted. If we're doing that, and there's 7 people on this paper, there's quite a lot of scientists on this paper, and I think for me it's about really use the people around you who've got the skill set to be able to do it. So, like, I draw on people who have used neuropsychology outside of sport because it's been around a lot longer, who have more sophisticated ways of kind of creating the pipeline for analyzing the data. I lean on them. So, like, I think
Mm,
it's been able to really say, where is your skill set? What are you trying to do? And if by pressing one button gives you a data point,
mm,
at this point, I would be really reluctant to say how reliable that is, given that the backdrop of experiments that we have, there are very, very limited session by session by, longitudinal designs
mm,
with kind of experts. So I think if you're looking at the expert novice comparison, we're on a safer ground. But when we're looking at what makes a difference for performance, imagine you're having that conversation with the athlete again,
mm,
and you're going to say, do this, it really helps do your performance. Do you really want to be saying 2 weeks later, oh no, sorry, do something different? Like that's not
mm,
going to help your coach athlete relationship. So for me, I think it's shiny, it's new, it looks amazing to see these squiggly lines that produce, often they change them to colours with red and green and all of this. But I think if you're ever in doubt, find someone and ask someone, what do you think of this technology, or how does
mm.
this? Because there are some, and as technology develops, it'll, they will come out to market and they'll be really sophisticated. But I think it's thinking about, am I the best person to make this judgment, or should I go and find someone else who might be able to tell me whether this piece of kit's all right?
Yeah, but I think that's a really valuable sort of warning, because as much as just right now with the age of AI and all these things, it's very easy to believe that that technology is here now and that it's widely available, but it sounds like it still isn't really, in terms of to really have it as a very trustworthy tool that you can use. You still have to go to the right places, might be universities, you need to acquire the right expertise. So I think it's really useful that you're able to kind of give us a bit of a, here's the red flags, where if you see something being marketed at you that's able to give activity around brain functions and other things that's linked to sport, you need to really do your research into just how much of an evidence base is supporting that, because it's probably more likely to not be everything it's building itself up to be. Does that then, and I know there's nuance to this, and you've also sort of importantly, Laura, give a bit of a warning sign around don't fix we ain't broke. In the meantime, then, for that coach, that mum and dad, who's at an amateur level, we're not even necessarily talking about experts. It could be that coach also that's working in an academy with youth players, or maybe the coach that is working with senior players. But for the coaches who don't have access to the expertise, to the not to the equipment, is maybe the most important sort of research instrument they can have themselves right now. And the questioning that they can have and the conversations that they can have with their athlete, should we maybe be applying value to that in the meantime? To have these conversations, to figure out what are the processes your athlete's going through. Is that probably a more trustworthy barometer of this than whatever these apps might be at the moment, if they don't have access to more expertise and more equipment?
Yeah, it's hard to say from a trustworthy point of view because it's
Well,
where
it
does
is
that go?
trustworthy,
But
I
from
know.
a point of view of, by creating better conversations, having, as long as you get the timing right of that conversation and it doesn't feel
Aye,
like an interrogation. But
just as they're
I
going in.
think, yeah, just as that idea around why, you know, your athlete well, and you also can ask the athlete, like I'm a big believer in an athlete knows if we're talking about a skill when they're not certain. And they also know when they're going into and they've got some of that hesitation. If they don't know the exact moment they hesitate, they know as soon as they've hit the start and they go, "Why did I do that? I wasn't ready,"
Mm,
or whatever that might be. So it's about seeing, well, how do they change? Can they fix that themselves afterwards? And if they might do that 3 or 4 times over the course of a couple of weeks, then you might say to them, "Have you noticed that?" Or you as a coach might want to have a look at, do they always hesitate on that side? Like, is there
mm,
something about that task? And then you might think, oh, what's going on with, and that's when you might use your coach's brain. So you observe that they always hesitate on one side. So you go, right, okay. Before asking them, I might do a little bit of watching and seeing and thinking about what do I know about this player.
yeah.
And then you can have a conversation. So I think yeah, for me, I
It
think,
makes me think a little bit about the sort of stimulated recall techniques that are out there as well. Like even like Amy Whitehead sort of think aloud stuff. I could see like what we could do in those spaces, like having athletes speak through some of the processes and live in the moment, or just, letting them judge it for themselves and then having the conversations. But they're again, live things that you can do that could offer a lot of potential.
Yeah, I think it helping people have conversations about what is it that you're doing, how does that relate to performance, not just on that single one, because you don't want people kind of going back and forth all the time. It's much more like consistency, patterns, and trends. But people then are not afraid to and for me, it is taking some of that judgment away of it's not your fault if you miss, but I'm really curious. Or,
Mm,
actually, you feel amazing when you're playing really well. You want to keep recreating that. Let's have a look at what goes on so that we can help recreate that. So you're building that perception of how can I make some of this recreatable?
yeah, no, fantastic. No, honestly, Laura, it's brilliant. Just to sort of recap, and I'll try my best here, and so far as some of the stuff that we spoke about, we've now sort of covered, in terms of the nuts and bolts of it, the suggestion that if you can commit to your plan, try not to deviate from that in the moments, the exact immediate moments leading up to a performance, a shot in a sort of dead ball situation here, contextualize the golf. But if we want to apply it and be philosophical, and as coaches, we want to find a link, we can try it in other sports perhaps and see. We've also sort of touched on sort of looking into the underpinning processes there, and actually I didn't know that there was brain waves that had different bandings and hertz, and again, we're now familiar with the different profiles there, but importantly we've also started to get an understanding that what makes for an expert performer's profile in itself isn't something that can be completely predicted, and that there is certain nuance even within that there's individuality to the way that experts will carry out the same task. And we've also, really importantly, in the last couple of points here, is we've spoke a little bit about actually the way that these experimental works are done and why we need to be mindful of the bias that's innate to them, but also learn how to better evaluate and how to better integrate the findings that we do see as coaches within our practice. And one solution to that, as we've suggested, is sort of like localized experimentation with um, whatever means you can do that. And that might be certainly in the age right now where access to reliable equipment and expertise is a bit varied, that perhaps our conversations and our questioning with our athletes can be the best tool that we have at our disposal, or at least the most practical tool that we can have access to right now while we wait for this technological boom to actually arrive, rather than just the trailers that we're seeing at the moment. I think I've caught most of that. If there's anything we need to add, then we can. But I would just like to say, really, really, really appreciate you coming on, Laura. Yeah, hope you've enjoyed that as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, thanks again for the invite. And yeah, I think, by all means, if people do want to kind of, if you are a sport or you are a coach and you think I want to see if this works, I'm more than happy to kind of have a conversation and kind of have a
Yeah,
discussion. But I think, like you say, we have to be realistic around like the EEG I use is very expensive, and app's £2.50, maybe, somewhere in the middle. So I think it's about really thinking about, are you in the best position to use this data, and who might be able to help you if you like to either collect the data or to be able to really work through, because I always talk about this, technology informed, not the technology making the decision for you.
yeah,
A coach is a real skill set, and I think don't let the technology take that away from you.
yeah. Always, I think the coach needs to be at the centre of everything. So, no, absolutely. Anyone that's interested in reading further around Laura's work, I'll put the link to the article in the description for this episode. It's open access, which is brilliant. There's also, for those of you that maybe want a kind of punchier read too, even though I would actually would say Laura's journal article is really well written. It's actually very succinct in the way that it's done, alongside the other colleagues that wrote the work with Laura. There is a shorter version available through the conversation, and I'll also attach the link to that as well, just for those that maybe want to have a bit of a summary there. Also, so no, well done. Thanks so much, Laura, and hopefully for everyone that's listening, that conversation was as helpful for you as it was for me. We will speak next time. So thanks, everyone. See you next time.